Okay, everybody, welcome to week 10 and chapter 13. Chapter 13 is all about hormones and sex. What's wrong with the mama wawa? Well, actually, we're not going to talk about mama wawa. And if you've already listened to the lecture on chapter 12, I let everybody know that because there are two chapters this week, I have condensed both of them, chapters 12 and 13. And so there will be a lot of this chapter removed from the PowerPoint slides, and therefore you are not responsible for that material. And so what I would do is I would watch these PowerPoint slides first, and then the material that you need a little bit more information on, I would go ahead and read in the textbook. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Developmental and activational effects of sex hormones. Developmental, influencing the development of anatomical, physiological, and behavioral characteristics that differentiate the sexes. That's what we mean by developmental effects. Activational effects are triggering reproduction-related behavior in mature individuals. And adolescent surges have both developmental and activational effects. Puberty. There are two separate glands that we're going to be talking about. The exocrine glands, those release chemicals into ducts which carry them to their targets. An example here would be sweat glands. The endocrine glands release hormones directly into the circulatory system. This is really the crux of this chapter, is on endocrine glands. Only organs whose primary function is hormone release are referred to as endocrine glands. Okay? So here you have an example. We don't talk about the pineal body very much. We will talk a lot about the hypothalamus, its effects on the pituitary gland, and then the pituitary gland in some relationship to the other parts of the body, the thyroid, the adrenal glands, pancreas, etc. Again, we are not covering all of these things in vast detail. Okay, we're going to be sticking to the cortical areas, so the hypothalamus again, primarily for the drive of sex, and we're going to be studying on that, but not so much the effects on thyroid or the pancreas and so on. Okay, so the neuroendocrine system and the glands, remember these are endocrine glands. The male testes produce sperm and the female ovaries produce ova. The classes of hormones that we're looking at here are the amino acids. Epinephrine, for example, is one of those. You have peptides and proteins, short and long chains of amino acids. And you also have steroids, which are synthesized from cholesterol. And they are fat soluble, able to enter cells and bind to receptors in cytoplasm or nucleus. Remember, again, going all the way back to chapters 3, chapter 4, we talked about in order to influence the brain, in order to influence a neuron, the chemical had to be lipid soluble in a very small molecule, right, to get through that neuron membrane. Sex steroids are released by the gonads. Androgens, an example there would be testosterone. The estrogens, an example there would be estradiol. Adult testes release more androgens and ovaries more estrogens. And progestins are also released in both sexes, but primarily for the preparation of the uterus and breast for pregnancy. The adrenal cortex also releases sex steroids. Okay, hormones of the pituitary. Now, the pituitary gland is known by many as the master gland. Okay, but we'll go into a little bit more detail on that and mention why. Tropic hormones influence the release of hormones by other glands. Posterior pituitary, hormones are synthesized in the hypothalamus here, and then the anterior pituitary, you have tropic hormones, which again stimulates the release of another hormone. So I'm going to show you a diagram here in a minute where we'll talk about the anterior pituitary, the posterior pituitary, and then after that how both of those are influenced by the hypothalamus. Okay, just to let you know where we are in the brain. Okay, so you have the massa intermedia, right? That's the thalamus. We know that hypo is below, so the hypothalamus is below the thalamus. And then if we follow that even further ventral, you'll get to the anterior and posterior pituitary glands. Okay, and they hang down there from that pituitary stalk from the hypothalamus. Okay. The neural control of the pituitary. How do we know that the pituitary gland is being controlled by the hypothalamus? Well, some researchers looked at bird subjects, and they looked at the light-dark cycling also and breeding changed hormone release. They looked at lesions and stimulation experiments established the hypothalamus as the regulator of the anterior pituitary. And these experiments did not explain how the signal was mediated, as the anterior pituitary is not connected to the hypothalamus by neurons. It has a little bit different structure there, and we're going to talk about that next. Okay. Posterior, the neural input from the hypothalamus. So you have vasopressin, you have oxytocin, synthesized in the hypothalamic, paraventricular, and supraoptic nuclei. Those are both hypothalamus. These nuclei have terminals in the posterior pituitary. Okay, so the posterior pituitary has that direct control, or you could say neural control from the hypothalamus. But the anterior pituitary is a hypothalamo-pituitary portal system, which carries hormones from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary, not through neurons. Okay, it's actually through the circulatory system. So let's look at that. Here on figure 13.4, control of the anterior and posterior pituitary by the hypothalamus. Let's look on the left-hand side first, and we'll read through these. Okay, number 1, releasing and inhibiting hormones are released from hypothalamic neurons into the hypothalamic or the hypothalamo-pituitary portal system. Okay, so this is the anterior pituitary, and it's being released into this portal system. Number 2, the hypothalamic releasing and hypothalamic inhibiting hormones are carried down the pituitary stalk by the hypothalamo-pituitary portal system. Okay. Number 3, the hypothalamic releasing and hypothalamic inhibiting hormones increase or decrease, respectively, the release of anterior pituitary hormones into general circulation. Okay. So you see that the green lines up there at the top, okay, so that's the hypothalamus, but the hypothalamus it's really placing those hormones into this portal system that's then sending them down into the anterior pituitary and then out through the body. Okay, also shown by those green arrows at the very bottom. Now, the posterior pituitary, number 1, oxytocin, vasopressin, etc., are synthesized in the paraventricular and supraoptic nuclei of the hypothalamus. So that is where they are synthesized. Number 2, then they are carried by axonal transport down the pituitary stalk. So now here you're looking at the purple lines, okay, and those are neurons, or those are neurons with their axons going from the hypothalamus all the way down into the posterior pituitary. So then number 3, oxytocin and vasopressin are released into general circulation from terminal buttons in the posterior pituitary. Okay, so 2 different ways of thinking about it there. The hypothalamus is really directly influencing the posterior pituitary. Still has an influence, but not directly to the anterior pituitary. Most people believe that the master gland would really be the anterior pituitary because of the amount and quantity of hormones that it does release. Okay, I also put this into the slides because I thought it was a nice summary for us. So up at the very top, the brain, neural signals, specifically we're talking about hypothalamus. For instance, releases gonadotropin releasing hormone. And then you have the hypothalamic portal system for the anterior pituitary. Then you have general circulation to the gonads, and then the gonads to the body tissues. Okay, so this just gives you a couple other steps below the anterior pituitary, where we were, which is what we were talking about in just the earlier slide. Okay, sex differences in the brain. Now this is a gonadectomy. So what that is that the gonads have been removed, causes cyclic gonadotropin release pattern in females. If you transplant testes to males or females, it causes steady male gonadotropin release patterns. Okay? So there is definitely a relationship here with that. Perinatal androgens lead to male patterns. Okay. And then we have anabolic steroid abuse. Okay. So anabolic or growth promoting. There is no firm scientific evidence that muscularity and strength are increased as a result of steroid use. There are sex-related side effects. There are issues in men such as the testicular atrophy, sterility, gynecomastia. In women, we look at sterility, excessive growth of body hair, and the cessation of menstruation as well. So many of you are familiar with anabolic steroid use, and we see these bodybuilders and so on with that. There are many side effects to this injection of this substance, and you can only imagine everything that we've talked about probably since chapters 6 or 7. There's always been a homeostatic nature to what we've been focusing on, right? We'll talk about levels of dopamine, or we'll talk about levels of serotonin, and it's not, if you have too much, if you have not enough, there's going to be an effect. The whole idea is to keep at that homeostasis. And so no doubt, same thing here. We have all of these hormones. You have the hypothalamus of regulating the pituitary gland then regulating other glands throughout the body, sexual glands, adrenal glands, whatever it is. And now you inject an enormous amount of this other hormone into the system, and it's just throwing everything out of whack. Okay. Okay. Neural mechanisms of sexual behavior. Here we're looking at the medial preoptic area of the rat hypothalamus. Again, we're still staying with the hypothalamus. It is larger in males due to estradiol shortly after birth, and size of male. The dimorphic nucleus, again, is correlated with testosterone levels and aspects of sexual activity. So in the hypothalamus, again, nuclei in the preoptic, suprachiasmatic, and anterior regions of the hypothalamus are larger in men than in women. So there are some differences that we see there. Okay, specific to the medial preoptic area of the hypothalamus, destruction abolishes male sexual behavior of mammalian males and females studied, but it does not affect female sexual behaviors in females. Okay, so destruction of the medial preoptic area in male or male sexual behavior in males and females studied. Okay, it abolishes the male sexual behavior. Stimulation elicits copulatory behaviors, and evidence favors a motivational role for male sexual behavior. What about the ventromedial nucleus? Contains circuits critical for female rat sexual behavior. Lesions in this area eliminate lordoses, which is posture assumed by females during mating. Microinjections of estrogen and progesterone induce estrus. And lesions of the paraqueductal gray, or the tracks to it eliminate lower doses. Remember, the only other thing that we talked about with para-aqueductal gray there was with the analgesic effects of morphine and that kind of thing, and endorphins. So interesting that comes up here also. Also, the ventral striatum is activated when individuals view sexually provocative images. So there's a component there. And so let's look at all of these put together. Okay? So here, cortex mediates the most complex aspects of sexual experience. There's no doubt there that this is some related to higher cortical levels. If you thought to yourself the difference between, sexual intercourse with animals, you're looking at, the terminology that you might use was just this sexual act, whereas in a human you're looking at, things of passion, things of love or whatever, and so of course there's higher order, higher level things that are going on there in the cortex. And then we go to the ventral striatum, associated with the anticipation and experience of sexual activity and other pleasurable activities. This is the one we just talked about with the visual cues, and that's happening there at ventral striatum. The hypothalamus is, of course, the focus of most of this entire chapter, and that the ventral medial nucleus plays a role in female sexual behavior. The medial preoptic area plays a role in male sexual behavior. Just saw that in the last couple slides. And then we also have the amygdala plays a role in the identification of potential mating partners. Remember the amygdala, fear and anger response, so all about emotions there with that. But here it plays a role in the identification of potential mating. So I thought this diagram really brought it all together for us. Okay, and that is it for chapter 13. So at the end of chapter 12, we had one e-lecture topic item, and now this is going to be your second e-lecture topic item, also worth 10 points. Okay, it says explain in detail and provide examples of how you believe the male and female brain are different. Again,